you have to be really charismatic and you have to be convincing, but actually the best sellers are excellent listeners. So if you're talking more than your buyer, you've already lost the sale. And it's a very early conversation. I would say you want them talking maybe 90% of the call. We spend far too much time at work for us to not be people first and for it to have meaning and value. I had a debate coach who taught me, be brief, be bold, be gone. That was his catchphrase. So I learned the importance of brevity and being able to get your point across pretty quickly.
It's tough because I think a lot of times, like when we were building package lockers back in the day to stop packages, it was after the fact, right? But it seems like what you all are doing is actually helping to stop crime in the moment.
Crime prevention is happening before the incidents actually take place so that residents and people feel safer. So I think really safety should be invisible, honestly, when it's working.
Excited to be here in the studio today with a good friend. She is a fantastic leader from the industry. We have Rakhi Voria, who has an incredible resume of having worked at some incredible tech companies, been a leader and one of the top leaders to follow in the world. So if you're not following her on LinkedIn and some of her writing for the Forbes Council, you should be. She has led sales teams around the world, from Microsoft to IBM to Procore and even Flock Safety, a local Atlanta company, and has helped hire thousands of people to join her teams and help drive billions of dollars. But more importantly, she's made a massive impact on people's lives through creating solutions for the most challenging problems in the world. And I'm really excited to dive in because Rakhi not only is a fascinating leader who's going to share some of her playbooks and her theories, but also a little bit about some of the things that people get right and some of the things that people can improve on in leadership. So Rakhi, I want to welcome you to the podcast. Thanks for joining us at Infinite Niches.
Thanks for having me. It's an honor to be here.
Of course. So I want to dive in first. I think one of the things that people think about is, how do I become a better leader? These stories and these lessons a lot of times are just handed down from experience. But I think there's oftentimes a better approach. So what are some of the stories that you have, or maybe a playbook, and how have you best learned about important leadership lessons?
For me, I think I just learned pretty early on in my career that the most important thing you can do on your journey to leadership is be yourself and believe in yourself. And I think I learned that the hard way in many instances. I mean, I started my career at Microsoft straight out of graduate school. I kind of fell into sales. It's not necessarily something I was targeting or dreaming of doing my entire career, but really wanted to work at Microsoft, and it just kind of ended up in that way. But there were so many instances, especially early in my career, where maybe I was the only woman in the room, the only millennial in the room, the only person of color in the room, sometimes all of those three things at once. And sometimes I think you feel like you're supposed to act a certain way in those instances, or if you're in sales or technology, let's put on a black suit so I can fit in, or whatever it might be. But I think I just saw from so many other leaders around me that what's really important in your journey to leadership is being authentic and genuine and not feeling like you have to leave yourself at home. And so I learned early on that the most important thing is to just be as genuine as possible. People can tell when you're trying to put on a facade and be somebody that you're not. So I always encourage, the future generation of leaders that that's the most important thing, honestly. The other things can be taught. You can study as much as you want. You have things like AI and ChatGPT at your fingertips to actually learn the business. But some of those fundamentals around just confidence and believing in yourself really requires you to have that within you.
I love that. As you just hit on the head, that's one of my theories, is that with AI, the realism, the authenticity of people being vulnerable and sharing not only all the successes, because a lot of social media is just what you just said, people showing off successes. They're not sharing the failures. They're not sharing the challenges you go through to get there. What's really interesting is you talk about falling into sales, you've been featured in hundreds of articles and written a ton of articles for Forbes on sales transformation, diversity in the workforce. What's an insight you've seen about sales that most people are still getting completely wrong?
I think the main thing is that sales is not about persuasion. It's actually more about diagnosis. And so, like, there's so many preconceived notions about what being a sales professional is. You often hear about the used car salesman, and people have so many negative connotations around sales. It obviously can get a bad reputation. As I said, I mean, I honestly fell into sales myself. It's not something I ever even naturally considered. But I think a lot of times people think of sales as, you have to be really charismatic and you have to be convincing. But actually, the best sellers are excellent listeners. So if you're talking more than your buyer, you've already lost the sale. And that's why we use things in sales like conversational intelligence, where we actually analyze what is our talk to listen ratio. That's something I look at for my team every single week. I literally review how my team is actually doing so I understand if they're listening and asking the right questions, because that's what sales is all about. So it should be really more of a collaborative, problem solving, consultative type of situation. And when you actually understand the buyer's world and their budget cycles and their risks, you don't need those tricks up your sleeves, right? It's more about being authentic again, because modern buyers these days, they can smell the inauthenticity very quickly, pretty instantly, honestly. So really important to just be focused on solving their pain and being authentic.
I think that was something I wish I had learned much earlier in my career, was that talk to listen ratio. I always
Yes.
felt like you, as a salesperson, you had to pitch and present and talk. And it was crazy once you started having those metrics to seeing it. What's a number you aim for? Is there a target, like a 70% that the customer's talking, a 50%, an 80%? Is there some kind of magical range you're looking for?
Upwards of 70%.
Mhm.
So I'd say that's the best way to focus. But I mean, if you can get into the 80s, even better. You want
Yeah.
to get them talking. I mean, of course, it changes over the course of the life cycle. If it's a very early conversation, I would say you want them talking maybe 90% of the call. You
Mhm.
want to just be asking a few provocative questions and show your curiosity and inquisitivity. But the majority of it should be them in the earlier cycles. And then later, as you get more and more into the conversation, that's when you're solution selling and might be increasing that percentage over time.
It's interesting because there's so many new salespeople who I ask that question to, and they'll usually be like, oh, yeah, they should probably be talking to them 50-50, I think.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I think the same thing, like you said, because if someone's just saying yes, oh, yeah, and then you just keep moving on, they may not even be now in this day of age, like you said, with Zoom and cameras off on a phone call, they might just be checking their email versus actually intently, wow, okay, let me dive into that. Or, hey, can you, if they're actually intensely asking the right questions. Writing is a special skill, especially to be able to be, I think with AI, storytellers are going to be in higher demand than ever. And it's not storytellers of make believe, it's storytellers to help the buyers understand solutions, understanding the outcomes and how to get there and the path to get there. So as you write, for Forbes and as you talk about vertical SaaS, why do you think the industry specific software companies are winning right now? And like, where is that trend going? And for those who don't know, can you define vertical SaaS a little bit?
Yes, I mean, vertical SaaS is essentially industry specific software. So the previous company I was just at as well, Procore Technologies, that was actually a construction tech company. So we sold project management software specifically to the construction industry, and that's it. And I think the reason why vertical SaaS is winning is because you can really go deep and into a very niche market and understand all of their pains and create a customized solution specifically for them. And so I think vertical SaaS, I mean, it reflects how buyers actually make some of their decisions. If you have industry specific software, you can actually understand their workflow, their compliance requirements, all of their economic realities versus just trying to create a point solution that can be applied to everything, like maybe some of my previous companies, Microsoft and IBM. And so I think that's helpful, whether it's multifamily, public safety, logistics, whatever. Vertical SaaS is just kind of how you compete these days, because I think buyers don't want generic platforms anymore. They don't want to have to customize. They want it to be super easy and purpose built for their specific world. And so I think that's the way to really be a true partner with the organization that you're trying to sell with, is if you're able to kind of evolve alongside them and are very focused on what they care about.
So funny you say that because, I remember, 15 years ago when I was getting into real estate, is shifting from retail of talking about dollars or talking about number of locations
Yeah.
at department stores, moved into real estate. And I'm like, oh, how many properties? And they're like, oh, we actually use units in housing, or in student housing, they use beds. Right. And switching from customer to resident, right? And those types of different terminology, as you mentioned. You're speaking my language, as you talked about Procore and now obviously with Flock Safety. Tell me a little bit more about moving into PropTech. I love PropTech. It's just a world I've gotten into. It's my niche. Love the built world because there's so many challenges from hardware, software, and things that we can touch and feel that are touching our families every day. What gets you excited about PropTech and real estate?
Well, PropTech actually is not something that I was into up until recently when I joined Flock Safety. And I now share the same level of excitement and passion that you do for sure, because I think it sits at the intersection of technology, but also real world impact and those long-term ownership decisions. So I've always in my career been drawn toward where, technology can actually solve real human problems, not just efficiency problems. And I think PropTech, especially multifamily, it's unique because decisions impact thousands of residents. It's not just a single buyer here, and safety is foundational to all of us, right? I mean, before amenities, before the finishes, people want to feel safe where they live. And so what excites me about PropTech and also Flock Safety and what we're doing is we're not just selling software. Obviously, we're helping owners create environments where communities can actually thrive. And we know, obviously, multifamily operators, they're very sophisticated. They're long-term thinkers, as I said, and that's what makes the conversations more fun because they're deeper, they're more strategic, and therefore more rewarding.
Yeah, to your point, it's definitely an industry. You talked earlier about reputation and transparency. It's a world where you see people in the industry 30, 40, 50 years. A lot of people have their names on the buildings, right? Or their family names over generations. So has that been a shift for you, coming from, a Microsoft or IBM and shifting over to PropTech, where in real estate, it is so interconnected? Is that something you witnessed over there as well? Or is it a little bit different in real estate?
It's a little bit different in real estate. I mean, in PropTech, you're not selling a feature, you're actually shaping the lived experience of a community. And so with that comes, sometimes generational companies who care about their legacy. And it's actually really exciting to be part of.
Yeah. Yeah, there's countless mentors who, I always say, one of the great quotes is from Toby Bizzuto. I'll never forget. I met him at an event in awe probably 12 years ago, and he said, "We are fortunate to be able to build sanctuary for the residents who live in our buildings." And I just thought that was an incredible way to think about it. And that, for him, he's thinking about legacy. He's thinking 20, 30, 40 years down the road. And that really stood out to me. So as we talk about, those types of people and mentors, who are some of the best leaders that you've met? And what did you take away from them? What was kind of the impact they had on your life?
I have been so fortunate to have a lot of strong role models in my life and in my career, from my first, really senior female boss at Microsoft, Debbie Dunham, to the CMO of IBM, Michelle Paluzzo, to the CEO of Procore, Tui Quartermanche. So I feel really blessed that I've been able to have that. But I think there's some commonalities between all of them. And it really consists of what I'd say is probably clarity, trust, and just having high standards. So I think the best leaders are people who create clarity, especially during change. That was actually one of Microsoft's core values, is how do you create clarity if you're a leader at this company? I think they also don't micromanage. So they set an incredibly high bar. They give you enough to go with, but then they get out of your way. So they really empower you to be successful yourself. They're consistent. I think the best leaders are people who where you stand with them, right? So you're not always trying to feel like you're on edge, trying to figure them out. They're so consistent about what makes them tick, what they like, what they don't like. So you can actually focus on what's important. And they deeply invest in their people. So I learned early on in my career from many of these people how to be a people first leader. And I've carried that throughout all of the companies that I've been at, because at the end of the day, we spend far too much time at work for us to not be people first and for it to have meaning and value. So I think a big part of leadership is just creating psychological safety for the people that work for you, but also accountability. That's what really leads to high performance, especially in sales organizations.
It's interesting as you talk about that, the two parts of that, of accountability, but also giving people the ability to make mistakes, right? And to feel comfortable to, try new things, and to, especially in sales, right? You're calling on people with a failure rate, a very high failure rate, oftentimes, or a non-response rate. How do you balance that accountability level of saying we need to hit these metrics, but we also want to, I think it's famous probably at Google and Microsoft and others, where they gave you a little bit of time to go experiment with other things and try new things. How do you think about that?
It's a balance, but I think the most important thing is setting very clear expectations on day one, and even before a person starts and before they sign their offer. So I think, of course, you have to set standards, metrics, milestones that people need to hit by certain dates. And you need to be really clear about that. But you also need to give them the tools to be able to do that. So a big piece of it is, do they have the right enablement, coaching, support, resources, playbooks, processes, tools, all of those things at their fingertips. So I think that's one of the things that tech companies do quite well, especially for people who are just starting their careers and thinking about where they want to work. Is that we do invest a lot in actually growing employees and ensuring that they have the tools at their fingertips to hit those milestones. But it's interesting. I mean, in sales, I have always been a big believer in the power of diversity in my sales organizations, and of course, there's diversity around the typical things, gender, race, et cetera. But I'm talking more diversity of age, background, thought, perspective, experience. All of those things are important when you're creating a high performing sales organization. And so because of that, I sometimes hire people who don't have typical sales experience, and I take chances on more people who might just have more of a consistent track record of success, but it might not be in B2B sales or in consumer sales, for example. And so sometimes, there are people who have to figure out, can they sink or swim? And unfortunately, there are some who do sink. And in those situations, it's a shame. But also, again, it goes back to those expectations being set up front, the clarity so that everybody knows what they're working toward, and that you can make some quick decisions if people aren't working out in the organization.
I love that. I think, as you just hit on that, I've met some people who have never been in sales in real estate. I'm like, as they're thinking about their next chapter, and I'm like, you just connect with people. It feels like you'd be great at sales because you are a great listener. You want to do the right thing, you care, and you're not going to just disappear after you sell. And we've all had that experience of, like you said, like the car salesperson who sadly just sells and then disappears out the window once the signature is wet. Who are some of the other people maybe outside the industry, or some people maybe some people who've written, because writing is an incredible skill. I'm thinking of, obviously there's Simon Sinek, who writes about your why, and Jesse Itzler and Sarah Blakely who talk about sales and growth. Are there people outside the industry or people that you read who've made an impact on you as well?
Yes, absolutely. So I'm actually a pretty avid reader. I love biographies, autobiographies. I love hearing people's stories. I recently read The Ride of a Lifetime about the Disney CEO, Bob Iger. So I'm constantly reading and listening, which is kind of a fun way for me to see people's journey. And also, as you mentioned, the failures that they had along the way. Everybody has had kind of what Sheryl Sandberg calls as the jungle gym ladder. It's not necessarily a linear approach. So I think I definitely look to kind of thought leaders in the industry to learn about leadership and how they've made it. But then beyond that, I mean, I think people across all levels can make an impact on you. And so for me, I mean, sometimes, of course, it's bosses and mentors. Oftentimes it's peers and team members and maybe even people below me in my organization. So I think about some of the early leaders who, maybe they gave me real responsibility before even I knew I was ready and took a chance on me, or some peers who were gold star in their roles that I was able to learn from them, or team members that maybe I went head to head with and butted heads with, but they challenged my thinking and helped me learn things around how to be able to get your message across with the right conviction. So I think people often think sometimes you learn most from people above you or people who have a certain title or sit in a certain place on the org chart, but I don't think that's true, actually. I think you can learn just as much from people who are down, up, across, and it's really important to have that mindset. Otherwise, you're missing a lot of opportunities.
You just hit on an emotional memory of mine where I worked in the corporate world 20 years ago, my first job out of college. And I'll never forget that my idea didn't count because I was the new one, because it had been done before. Someone else had already thought of that. Didn't work. We actually got $1 million budget to work on it. It was part of a contest, and it worked. And it was because we retried it in a different way, and we learned from the people who had done it 10 years before them, right? Or before us. And so I think you're right, is like, great ideas can come from anywhere. And oftentimes I think many great ideas come from outside the real estate industry. Sometimes they come from great operators, but sometimes they come from outside because people question why it's always been done this way. As you talk about that, I love that, and something I think about too is oftentimes the hardest part of any journey is the first step. And I think about that a lot with writing. And some people say, oh, they're just a natural born salesperson, a natural writer, born with it. Do you agree with that? Or is that, were you born with being a great speaker and a great writer? Or is that something you really had to work on?
I think it's something I had to work on. Sure, there are certain people who are born with certain qualities. And I think I was born with certain qualities around communication, but I also had to practice a lot along the way. And so, I think about my ability to speak, I guess. I would actually attribute some of that to my early days in like high school speech and debate, actually. I had a debate coach who taught me be brief, be bold, be gone. That was his catchphrase. So I learned the importance of brevity and being able to get your point across pretty quickly. So I think speaking came more natural to me once I practiced more, but then also once I stopped trying to sound impressive and just focused on being useful. And so I'll be honest, like I am not the loudest person in the room or on a leadership team. I don't think I've ever been, but I had a boss recently tell me, he said, you don't speak as often, but when you speak, we all listen. And I was actually really proud of that because it was a reminder, especially in sales, you don't have to be this big, bold personality and voice. You can be yourself, you can build a strong brand. And I think a lot of times, actually, that's why sometimes they say that women are actually better at sales than men in many instances, because we're not the loudest person in the room, because we're nurturing with relationships. We ask a lot of questions. We're inquisitive. We focus on identifying pain, things like that. So long-winded answer to your question, but the answer is no. I would not say that I was born with all of this. You really have to practice. And I think the same goes for writing too.
Oh, that's great. I think that's important what you said about the brevity and clarity. One of the things I think, like any tool, you have to keep working at it. And they oftentimes people look at professional athletes and say they're natural or they have height or they have this, but they work at it. And, Kobe Bryant was famous for being in the gym and would tell people a certain time, but he'd get there half an hour earlier. These athletes would work out, sometimes 15 hours a day. And I don't think people, realize that. And the same thing in sales and leadership is it's something that I've always heard, like oftentimes on speaking, to put in 4 times the amount of time of prep for every 1 hour, 4 hours of prep for every 1 hour you're going to speak. What's your thoughts on sales? The people who say, oh, I'm better when I've heard this from salespeople. I'm better when I wing it, do you often find that those people who can somehow wing it and sometimes just do it off the top of their heads outperform the people who actually put in the prep, the discovery, and have best practices?
I mean, I don't know about that, but I would say I believe strongly that preparation matters. And I think over time you can develop skills that allow you to be quick on your feet and so much information that you might not have to do as much of it. But I do think generally people who prepare and who are thoughtful and take the time to really understand are more successful than others. But I also believe strongly in the value of working smarter, not harder. So I don't necessarily care how many hours somebody is doing something. I care about the output. And today we have so many tools and resources at our fingertips with the rise of AI that I actually think you're doing yourself a disservice if you're not taking advantage of all of those things. And so I think working smarter, not harder, is really important. Preparation matters. And again, it also goes back to really putting the time and effort, but being smart about the way that you're doing it.
Love that. And you've been in sales now for over a decade. What separates the top 1% of salespeople as you're coming across people right now from everyone else?
Well, I think the main thing is they prepare relentlessly, right? Like they're the ones that ask better questions, they stay calm under pressure, but they also take full ownership of outcomes, the wins and the losses. And I think that mindset is what really creates that consistency. So the top 1%, I mean, it's not necessarily the people that are most charismatic. They're the ones that are the most disciplined and the most curious, I think. And I do believe that's teachable. Angela Duckworth, she has a book called Grit. She talks a lot about this. And again, it goes back to practice as well. So what's hard is the willingness to be coached and to continuously improve, even when things are going well, because sometimes you have reps who are hitting their numbers, but maybe their process isn't that great. And it's easy to say as a leader, well, whatever, they're hitting their quota, so they must be doing something right, even though they're not following all these things that we're asking them to do. I think that's really bad, actually. I think you have to have some level of consistency and standardization in an organization, because it doesn't matter if you have one really great person. What if that great person quits tomorrow and then nobody else has learned their process and is able to actually replicate it? So, yeah, I think it's really important to make sure that you have people who have that level of curiosity and hunger.
So I mean that's good. Leads to my next question. Obviously with AI, as you're talking about it, you have all these tools at your hands, and I think with AI, it's going to help you pull all the data. It helps you prepare. It helps you, especially as we're thinking about resumes. And obviously, your team is growing. You've hired thousands of people. You probably interviewed maybe over 10,000 people through group interviews and whatnot your teams have. How do you think about with LinkedIn? Now over 1 billion people on the platform, people can instantly click a button and it automatically preps your resume and sends it off. And I'm hearing from these people that they're getting hundreds and if not thousands of roles. What are the key traits you're looking for? You talked about curiosity. You talked about being open, owning outcomes. Love this. What are some of the key traits you're looking for in these sales talent when you don't know them, but yet you're about to bring them into your organization and depend on them to stand out to the top of the pile?
Well, Chris, you're absolutely right. I mean, in this day and age, you can write all the right buzzwords on your resume to get picked up and get an interview. I mean, the thing that I still look for amongst everything is, do you have a consistent track record of success? So again, I had mentioned earlier, I don't care as much about if you have years of B2B sales experience or that you've been a seller at so-and-so company. I mean, of course, that gives you a leg up because you've already done the job somewhere else. But I am willing to take a chance on the person who was an athlete, who was a dancer, who had started a nonprofit, whatever it was, as long as they can demonstrate that they have a consistent track record of success over a period of time where they learned, grew, and took on more. So I think that's the most important thing for me to gauge on whether or not somebody would be able to be successful in sales. Of course, there's all of the non-negotiables. Can they communicate effectively? Can they write good emails? Can they be on a Zoom call? Can they go in front of a customer? Things like that. That's kind of table stakes. But that track record is kind of the way that I differentiate candidates, I suppose. And then I think the other way to test is you still have to have a really robust interview process. And so, I know a lot of companies are moving toward fully virtual or even AI based, where you don't actually meet with a true hiring manager. It fully goes through an online process. I'm not there yet. We don't do that. We don't always meet everybody that we're going to hire in person. Oftentimes we don't meet them in person, but we do quite a thorough interview process online where we do role plays, they do written assignments. Of course, you have the typical hiring manager interview, things like that. So I think having more of a holistic process allows you to see a person in different ways.
Oftentimes the generalities, I always thought at one point in my career, to be a generalist and to be really good at all these things equally, but that's not being human. In reality, you're going to be great at some things, you're going to be horrible at others. And I think to your point, it's really important to know what you're bad at and get the feedback quickly and then move so you can be spiky at other things that you're really passionate about and stand out. To your point about AI, I think right now with AI coming on, speed is going to be one of our greatest differentiators. So, I'd love to hear, you have worked at companies that have had a very strong team of engineers, right? They have been tech companies from the beginning, right? How do you keep up with that kind of pace of innovation? Is that a great thing for a sales team? Is that a tough thing, especially if you're able to innovate quickly? How are you keeping up with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think speed is really important, especially if you're at a high growth company, because in order to really have speed, you do need to still be focused and you need to stay very close with your customers, because it doesn't matter how fast you're going. If you're not actually in lockstep with what the customer segment needs, then you're building and creating all of these things that might not actually be of value. So I think the reason why companies like Flock innovate quickly is because we are deeply connected to the problems that our customers face every day. So we don't build in isolation, we build in response to some of those needs, the feedback, the real urgency that we're seeing, especially at a company where our mission is to help eliminate crime. You have that real urgency, and being able to provide and equip businesses, communities, police departments, you name it, with the right tools at their fingertips is the difference between a life or death situation. So I think with that comes a huge responsibility, of course. So I think maintaining that pace, it really requires you to empower your teams, to think about your organizational structure in a way that reduces bureaucracy, and being able to comfortably kind of learn, test, fail forward, fail fast, iterate quickly. Because velocity, it's not fully about moving fast. It's also about removing that friction and learning along the way.
Great way to put it. As I think about the speed of movement, my father was a police officer and firefighter for 30 years. And it was really interesting because, he said a lot of the tools they had at their disposal weren't constantly changing. Whereas now I just talked to someone in the industry, a multifamily, and his son turns out is trained to become an aerial drone pilot as a police officer, which was so cool. And you all are building these drones now here in Georgia, which is really exciting. Like the founding team is out of Georgia Tech, here in Atlanta, building the drones here in the United States, which is a great story, creating jobs here in the US. But again, building hardware and software is not easy. That pace of innovation, and like you said, being able to fail, but having great customers. So how do you balance that of being able to have teams spread across the country, but also and working with teams across the country, and then also thinking about whether it's integrations or the balance of that hardware and software together? Like, what are some of the complexities of that sale? Like you said, working with a customer on education, and then around hardware and software.
Yeah, it's interesting because this is actually the first time that I've been at a very hardware first company. And of course, we have the software, the underlying AI, the operating system, et cetera, which is kind of the bread and butter. But we also sell cameras and license plate readers and all of these things. And so I've learned a lot about the fact that once you sell something, the process doesn't stop. It really starts a new process. You have to think about implementation, permitting, all of those things. And that's what's great about Flock, is that our product comes with all of those things in one. So the subscription actually includes all of that, which is great. But I think, you really have to be focused on the outcomes, and you have to balance your time. So being able to have those cross-functional relationships internally, being able to make trade-offs also. I mean, in an environment where we want to do so many things for so many different sectors, you have to really think about where are you going to get the biggest bang for your buck and the best outcome. So I think the best thing in a high growth environment and tech company is you have to have people who don't wait to be told what to own, people who are willing to raise their hand, roll up their sleeves, because I think growth rewards people who kind of learn faster from the business changes. And that's really what's important at a company that's really trying to do both hardware and software, is you have to have people who are kind of willing to raise their hands and support those relationships early.
Yeah, no, it's interesting too, because, in this industry has always traditionally just bought the hardware, but there was always a risk to buying that hardware. Seems like y'all are de-risking that now, where you're creating that reward for someone to, hey, make an investment, but we're going to take on all the risk, because there's always a fear that technology is going to be outdated in the future. But it sounds like you are going that route of providing the whole, consultancy, technology, the software all in one. And then if something goes wrong, you take it on. You're essentially creating almost like a guarantee of that product.
Yeah, exactly. And it works out perfectly because you have shared incentives, basically. I mean, ownership, they might want to have some of the control, but nowadays what we're seeing is that flexibility and risk reduction actually matters more to them. And so our model, it ensures that clients have the most up-to-date technology, but they don't have to worry about things like the maintenance or hidden costs or fees. Every time something new comes out, it'll just sort of be given to them. And so I think that helps you have more of a longer term partnership instead of just a one-time transaction where you're buying a physical product and you're putting a pole in the ground and you have no idea if you're ever going to get upgraded or not, which is exactly how our customers kind of think about the assets that they're purchasing.
Awesome. Well, I'd love to hear, since joining the team, at Flock, what's one of your favorite stories you can share?
I'd say my favorite stories that I could share really center around, obviously when we've been able to help prevent a crime. So there's countless examples of this, which is really really powerful to be part of. Flock, obviously, we're on a journey to help with that. Our goal is to eliminate crime, as I mentioned. I know it seems like a lofty goal, but it truly is our North Star. Today, I mean, about 2,800 crimes are solved per day with the help of Flock technology already. That's over 15% of crime or reported crime in the US is being solved with Flock. We want that to be 100%. One of my favorite stories was my first week at Flock. I went to our big company-wide conference where we announced that over 1,000 missing people had been located using Flock technology. And that was really powerful because you just sort of remember that what we're doing is actually saving lives and preventing situations from happening. But, obviously we still have a lot of work to do. And so I think any story where I'm hearing about, whether it's saving a life or even recovering stolen property or protecting a resident or preventing theft, whatever it might be. I mean, every day somebody is having kind of the worst day of their life. And if you can be part of a company that's helping to solve that, I think that's really powerful. So fortunately, we actually have something at Flock where it's called Solved Stories. So every day you see dozens of stories that come through. And anytime you're having a tough day, it's a great reminder to kind of go to that Slack channel and just kind of read about what's happening, because that's what really helps you reinforce why we do and the fact that it matters. So it's really powerful being part of a company like that.
Yeah, it's incredible. I mean, we have it in our neighborhood. Obviously, Atlanta is a hotbed. We've had some issues, crime, and they had Flock in our neighborhood, and I can now see them right around different cul-de-sacs and neighborhoods and schools and things like that. And it's interesting because I was talking to a police officer, and they've actually said, I remember it being on the news when there was a shooting in a community that they actually, police chief, I think when they were, thanking the officers when they found the suspect hidden in a garage, they actually called out Flock right on the press, the press meeting. And that's pretty incredible to have that being said about a product and a solution. It's tough because I think a lot of times, like when we were building package lockers back in the day to stop packages, it was after the fact, right? But it seems like what you all are doing is actually helping to stop crime in the moment. I know you all have some lofty goals and been able to see, the transparency and Garrett coming out, a lot of interviews. I think he was on the cover of Forbes recently as well. It's interesting to see with that transparency and sharing these stories, what does the world look like, in 5, 10, 15 years, in your view, if Flock is successful?
Well, I think the goal, again, would be to help eliminate crime, honestly. And I think we're well on the path toward that. We've made good progress, but we're laser focused on increasing those numbers that I shared in our pursuit to have more thriving communities. So I think we need a world in 5 years where public safety becomes proactive, not reactive, where communities are sharing intelligence responsibly instead of operating in silos, and where crime is actually happening. Crime prevention is happening before the incidents actually take place so that residents and people feel safer. So I think really safety should be invisible, honestly, when it's working. And as you mentioned, there are a number of press releases and things that happen that make us feel great about what we're doing. I mean, the tragic shooting at Brown and MIT last month at the press conference, the Providence Police Chief, Colonel Oscar Perez, he stated the only reason we got to this was because of Flock. And so I think, when your technology is helping people sleep better at night, you're doing the right thing.
Yeah. And you hit it on the head earlier in the conversation is that, I used to think when I was single, didn't have kids, wasn't married, oh, I want the golf simulator in my apartment. Oh, I want, the pool. Everything in my life now comes down to, as you said, it is, as I think about it, it's safety. It's about, do I feel comfortable? Do I feel like I'm in a good place? You don't want to be worrying. And, luckily we live in one of the greatest time to ever be alive, right? With technology. So very excited about that. Well, I really appreciate you being on, Rakhi. This has been a blast. I want to ask you, is there anything I left out that you wanted to talk about? Is there any tips or advice or someone you left out that you wanted to talk about?
I think you had mentioned it as well. I think you actually recently had a chance to go visit one of our real-time crime centers, I believe, in your local area. And you had maybe heard some stories there about Flock as well. And I think the most important thing for PropTech and property managers is we don't just sell technology. We obviously actively partner with law enforcement. And so from day one, the platform's really built with public safety agencies in mind. It's not an afterthought. And you saw that front and center when you visited on the ground. We invite anyone who's interested to come spend time in a real-time crime center that's powered by Flock. But that partnership is really what allows communities and property owners to share that critical information in real time versus just documenting after the fact. And what makes this powerful is the trust piece of things. I mean, that's kind of the most important thing. And at the end of the day, like, crime doesn't respect property lines. Our partnerships reflect that reality, and that's why things work. So that's what I would say. I think, strong partnerships, it really start with aligned incentives and shared accountability and making sure the result is trust. And trust is what allows technology to make a difference in preventing crime, not just responding to it.
Yeah, and thanks for having me out there. It was pretty cool to see here in Atlanta at the crime center.
Yeah.
But to your point, the level of integration, the level of working together across agencies, across properties, across real estate, and people's lives. And it was really, really interesting, the stories they had to share. I think one of the toughest things is pursuit. I've ridden along with my father in the cop car probably over 30 times. And the amount of pursuits you had to be in versus, I feel like that's something that they talked about, was that, having this ability with cameras and to be able to safely apprehend people and to stop people. So yeah, keep it up. Love seeing these stories of catching crime rings, right? And stopping theft and keeping our neighborhood safe. So Rakhi, this was awesome. Thank you so much for sharing your story. I feel like we could go on another conversation in the future for sure. But yeah, keep up the great work. And if people want to work with you, what advice do you have for them? Is there a great way for them? Are you hiring right now for great talent out there?
We're hiring across all divisions of the company. So if Flock Safety and our mission is resonating with you, I invite you to reach out to me directly on LinkedIn, and I will definitely get you connected with the right teams and individuals from our recruiting team to have a conversation.
Yeah, be sure to follow Rakhi on LinkedIn. Any other socials you're on, or is LinkedIn the main one?
LinkedIn's the main one. Yeah, that's a great place to find me.
Awesome. You can see her writing on there. Thanks so much, Rakhi. All right. Have a great week.
Thanks for having me.